So I'm just going to take out.
You done? Sorry, I'll go again. ये ठीक है? Rolling.
Hi.
I am from Make My Trip, Snapdeal,
Filter It, Tune,
Paytm, Domino's Pizza India.
Welcome to Mobile Marketing Association.
I work with the performance marketing team of Snapdeal, which is one of the most popular e-commerce destinations in India. And mobile is extremely important for us, like it would be for any e-commerce company in India, because it contributes to about 2/3 of the business that we get on any day, which includes mobile app as well as M-site. So yeah, it is extremely important that we understand how we are driving users towards it. What kind of users are we getting, those who are converting on mobile platform, and how do we measure the effectiveness of our marketing investments. The most recent experience that I can talk about is festive season. So this year we were far more cautious about putting money in app specific advertising, but last year festive season, which is Diwali in India, we were trying to scale up very aggressively, which means we were trying to acquire more users. Diwali as a time is extremely important in India because people want to move to e-commerce and they want to experiment with e-commerce as a format. Mobile just happens to be their first point of journey. At that time, when we were putting in millions of dollars in mobile advertising, we realized that a significant percentage of it went towards fraud specific activities, which we discovered after some point of time. Essentially, for any marketer, whenever they are making any investment, they have to see at least same proportion results to the tune of investment. We started noticing, and these were early signs, that while the business was growing from app or app installs were growing, but not with the same pace that we had expected. For instance, if our investments have gone few X, the acquisition was only a part of that. So for us, that was a red flag. With this early thought, we started to think of ways that we could really be sure whether there is fraud or not. At that time, we started figuring out that maybe we should just look at the metrics, and we started analyzing data purely from the customer lifetime perspective. But as is the nature of fraud, it is not easy to get or easy to capture fraud simply by looking at customer lifetime data, because every fraudulent transaction or fraudulent acquisition will generally merge very well with the overall data. So we understood that probably the problem is far more difficult. The second thing that we had to look at was variations. And when we started looking at data deeply, we realized that there are some variations or some patterns that are different from averages. For instance, higher time taken to convert a user, or low uninstall rate, or extremely high uninstall rate, which I'll explain in detail. Essentially, just to summarize it, that we noticed that the behavior of these users was pretty much like organic customers when we started combining all these data points, because the customer lifetime value is more or less same as that of a direct customer. Second, there was high amount of variation, which means while they looked like a normal customer, they were not really a normal customer purely from a transaction perspective, because a lot of these metrics were very different. When we understood that, after that we went all in to figure out what is the real extent of fraud, and we started solving for it. I understand that fraud is very sophisticated, so our understanding of fraud also is, as of now, maybe slightly limited for partner to partner. In some cases it would be about just as low as 10%, and in many cases it would be around 40%, which we were really surprised by. And many of these partners were of international reputation, those who are exhibiting in different countries, telling about or talking about themselves as the leaders in mobile advertising space. We realized that it was affecting everyone equally. Few things that any marketers will have to do, they'll have to look at data very differently. First of all, you have to understand that fraud will most likely exist. The question is, how much of a fraud are you okay with? In our case, if it is not beyond certain percentage points, you should be okay with that. Although you should be aware of this as a bigger problem, but the moment it exceeds, you have to definitely take an action. The way we went after this problem was, first we were looking at simply the type of customers. Wherever the type of customers is more or less like organic customer, because from our experience, we've noticed that organic customers are not always similar to the customers that you acquire. There will be some differences, right? Organic customers generally come because of advertising campaigns that are mostly around brand building. They have a different behavior than those who we push to download an app or make a transaction. So that was the first cut. If you see too much of similarity between acquired customers versus organic customer, you should investigate further. The second level of cut would be behavioral. In behavioral cuts, you would look at different kind of metrics. For instance, time required to install the app, time required to complete a transaction, time required to add a product to cart. If you see vast variations in different metrics compared to an average, it's a sign that something is probably wrong. I'll give an example here. For instance, if you notice that the time required for adding a product to cart and concluding a transaction in general, I'm giving just an example number here, is 60 seconds. And if you notice that in case of certain publishers who are working with us, it is less than 10 seconds, it's an alarm bell for us. Because they might be just firing clicks at the back end to claim a credit for that transaction. Likewise, we started breaking down the entire funnel, and we just saw variations at different ends to figure out what was the fraud. Extremely important. I think number one reason for this is it clouds your thinking about your marketing decisions. What you think or what you claim to be your work actually may be just a simple organic customer coming to you anyway. So when the amount of fraud goes up, you essentially start to see that fraudulent transactions are eating into organic customers. You will not be able to prioritize where to put money. So what might appear to be a cheap install or a cheap transaction actually could be a free transaction for you anyway, because these are the people who are likely to come to you. So as the number of fraudulent transactions will go up, you will only become more ineffective or biased about your marketing decisions. So I would say from that perspective, it is extremely important to estimate the amount of fraud in your overall marketing mix. I would recommend a multi-step process here. The first thing is basically to accept the fact that fraud exists. Once you do that, I think the problem becomes far easier, and don't be biased by the usual metrics that you look at. Let me explain that in detail. So if you notice that you're going after simply customer acquisition, the cost per acquisition or cost per install in case of fraudulent channels or fraudulent advertising might be lower than the usual cost, which might appeal to a marketer very well, because it will look like, okay, I'm getting X number of installs at a much cheaper cost. But do not get biased simply by the metrics that you generally go after. Understand that fraud is a real possibility. Once you understand that, then you start to lay down a comprehensive structure around it, which means what metrics are important for you. I think the metrics that could matter to marketers are: what is the percentage of fraud that you notice? What are the different variations that variations that you see? How many organic transactions or customers probably fraud is eating into? Once you start to lay down these metrics clearly, you can measure those also effectively. And the way you measure those is either you can have your own team. So I do feel that it's a skill set to find out fraud, but you don't necessarily need to build a big in-house team to figure it out. Having a mindset and then building some dashboards might help. And then you could also take help of partners who specialize in these kind of products or solutions. Apart from associations and bodies, a huge responsibility also lies on the part of participants of the ecosystem. And I would say the biggest weight has to be borne by, for instance, mobile measurement attribution partners. There are a couple of them nowadays that a company can work with: AppSolar, AppsFlyer, Tune, and likewise there are a couple of them. So they have to have very strong anti-fraud solutions, because you're relying on them to give you the true picture. So I would say that they need to pull their weight and make sure that there are capabilities to address problem of fraud. Then I'm quite sure, like I've thought about this problem, rather than an advertiser like us who is just waking up one fine day to realize the possibility of fraud, intermediaries also have a big role to play here. For instance, ad networks, right? We noticed a massive percentage of fraud coming from certain ad networks, which were, so to say, quite reputed. Why don't they have systems and checks in place? Because after massive fraud, we have stopped working with them. So I'm not going to name those, but the reality is, if they had a strong system in place before we could realize it, it would have been far more easier for us to work with them, because they would have come to us saying, hey, listen, I think this is what you should not be paying for, because we have deducted it on account of suspected fraud. So number one recommendation, after you have believed that fraud exists, believe in measuring quality of customers from a customer lifetime perspective, which means understand that if there is a very good customer quality that you notice from an acquisition channel, it is likely to be something fishy there, because these transactions purely could have been organic transactions, which means have a holistic view of customers and don't feel great if the customer quality looks equal to that of the organic customer. It is rather an alarm bell. That's one. Two, learn to break down the entire funnel and identify deviations, which means if you notice that at some stage the funnel varies or the step varies vastly from the average, it's a potential sign of a fraud. And third, time and again, it might look like you're getting unemployed, but just switch off certain marketing channels and see whether the overall business goes up or down. If you notice that overall business has not necessarily reduced after you switching off certain ad networks or important partners, probably there is fraud that you were not able to account for, or maybe it is not adding as much value. We partnered with one company in this journey, and we use their tool. It's called Mexpresso, and their tool called Mfilter It. These guys were helpful for us to figure out the extent of fraud. I think pretty much that thing only. Like, once you understand that fraud may exist, maybe it may not exist as much in your case if you're not investing on a lot of partners, but the moment you start to do that and you go beyond top 2 to 3 players in advertising ecosystem, you'll discover more and more fraud. Once you do that, you can also lay down metrics that are important to you and your organization. Don't be blindsided by simple metrics which look very attractive, like cost per install going super down, cost per transaction going extremely low, or cost of new customer acquisition. Don't be blindsided by these, because they might be masking your fraud in between. And then after that, figure out if you can work with a partner, and then obviously lay down the analytics around the funnel that I've been stressing upon.